attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, let this blessed assurance control, that Christ has regarded my helpless estate, and hath shed his own blood for my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin, not in part, but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. And Lord, taste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul.
We invite you to stay tuned for the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of Mayfield Drive Baptist Church, located in Smyrna, Tennessee. We will now join the service.
All right. We welcome you back again to our Wednesday evening Bible study at Mayfield Drive Baptist Church. in Smyrna, Tennessee. So, with all the hacking and coughing and everything going on, we'll try to get on with, including myself. So we are still studying concerning the life of the Apostle Paul, the chief. Reason that we named, it's been a while since I've said that, the reason I named this study the chief, because at one point Paul said that he was the chiefest of sinners. And the reason he said that was because that he had persecuted the Lord's church. So anyway, shipwrecked. I think I said the last week that the shipwreck that we are going to look at this evening, and we began our look last week, is only one of about 3 or 4 that Paul had endured during his time of ministry. And this shipwreck was not one of them. 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, I think it was the reference that we considered last week, where he listed the things that he had gone through. He had been stoned. It's what? 2 Corinthians, yes. And in that list, he had named shipwreck, I think, 3 times. And this was not part of that list. So this happened after that he had written that to the church at Corinth. So our text comes from Acts chapter 27, beginning with verse number 9. We'll go through verse 20, and then the rest of the verses of the chapter when we get to them. Now, when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them, and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with much hurt and much damage, or with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. Now let me pause here for just a minute. I wouldn't lean on this centurion too awful much because Paul was outnumbered here by the people that not only operated the ship, the captain, the master would have been the captain of the ship, and the owner. The centurion, because of his position, might have been able to force them to not do it, but if it had backfired, he would have been in big trouble. So he was in a sort of precarious position there. And so I wouldn't feel too hard against him because that he decided what he did. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain Phoenix. One pronunciation of that is Phoenix. That's a modern pronunciation and spelling of it. This is Phoenix. And there to winter, which is an haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and the northwest. This is the position of this particular harbor. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence they sailed close by Crete. And not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Eurocydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat. When which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strapped sail and so were driven. Well, I'll give you some details on that. That's extra scriptural. When we, being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. Excuse me. And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. Now I would say that the way that Luke wrote this, cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship, I take that to mean that he and Paul and the others with them, meaning maybe some of the other prisoners and passengers of the ship, they helped the sailors and the soldiers to cast things overboard. They're trying to make the ship lighter in order to stay afloat. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. So by way of introduction, the Rome-bound party had transferred to a substantial ship out of Alexandria, Egypt. Now this ship is, for that day and time, quite large, because we have a number that's thrown out there at us. We've looked at it before. 63, I believe it is, people on board. So that's a good sized ship, plus cargo. It was completely laden with wheat. That's what the scripture says. It was with wheat. No mention of any other cargo. Of course, they had a number of people as passengers. The time of year was no longer in their favor, in that winter was coming on, and it would very soon not be conducive to sail the seas. Now, the only methods they had of propulsion were the winds or slaves with oars. That was it. The ideal time for sailing in that part of the world in those times was from April to October, during the spring, summer, and early fall. Rest of the time, there might be storms, but nothing like it is in the winter season. At best, they were pushing the time frame of safety. It had been slow sailing for many days, but they finally arrived with much difficulty off Cnidus. I don't have any information on that, but apparently it was a small port on the coast of Crete. There, the wind forced them to sail west under Crete off Salmone. They are going in a direction that they don't really want to go in, but they don't have much choice. Again, with much difficulty, they arrived at Fair Havens in the south part of Crete. In other words, they're on the bottom side of Crete. They spent much time, verse 9, there. We don't know how long. But much time means that must have stretched in for several days. Shipwreck. Sailing was now dangerous because the fast or the Day of Atonement was over. Now, this gives us a time frame. Okay? So we know when the Day of Atonement was. And this Luke puts in there to give us a time frame about this journey. We already know it was at this particular time of year, but this makes it definitive. We have a definitive time hack, if you will. So we know exactly within a few days of when it was taking place. This is important because this would have been around September or October. Remember I said they're already pushing the time frame of safety. Now when they set out from Caesarea, there would have been enough time for them to make it into Italy before the winter season set in. But they've been delayed by storms and contrary winds. So that now, at this point in time, they are weeks behind what they would normally have been. So now they're in trouble. Paul advised the centurion that the Lord had revealed to him that the voyage would end in disaster. Now, maybe if this centurion had known Paul better, he would have paid more attention to Paul. But now understand, it's just been a few days. It hasn't been long since they have set sail from Caesarea. And they've changed the ships one time. So Julius, the centurion, he doesn't know Paul as well as maybe he should. If he had known Paul very well, then he would have known that he should pay attention to what Paul was saying. It would be the loss of all the cargo and the ship, with the possibility of the loss of their lives. So this is a danger-fraught situation with little options that they have at hand. The centurion, however, was persuaded otherwise by the master and owner of the ship, because Fair Havens was not a suitable port to spend the winter. Maybe I should have done a little bit of research in here on what would have made a suitable port to spend the winter, but I did not do that. I apologize. What I would say is that the standard things should be available. When I say standard things, it would be things like, okay, does this port have enough food stocks and water that we can have or buy, or whatever means of obtaining? Do they have enough that we can survive for 3 months? Okay. Is it sheltered enough? Is the harbor sheltered enough so that the ship would not be damaged? That's also a concern. Yes. Yes, would there be enough, say again? Fuel, yes. Whether it was wood or some other substance, yes, that would have been a concern as well. Was there enough fuel there because you're going to have some heat because it's not going to be warm. So all of those things would just be, all right, that goes without saying. This has to be in place in order for us to stay here for the winter, a minimum of 3 months. Okay? So the majority prevailed. Now, apparently, it was a decision that had more input than just Paul's. And I suspect Paul was very outvoted. So, sorry. So the majority prevailed, and the decision to try for Phoenix was made. The spelling, as I pointed out, is a little different, but this is the modern spelling that I've used here. Phoenix was a harbor that faced both southwest and northwest, which apparently made it a safer haven. In other words, the ship would be safer there. They wouldn't be in as much danger of the ship being damaged while it was in port because of the weather.
Because the winds are all moving east-west.
Yes. It seems to be, yes. Yes. Even here in central United States, where does the majority of our prevailing weather come from?
Northwest.
West and northwest. If it comes from the east, you better batten down the hatches because it's going to be bad. I mean, not that the weather from the west and northwest can't be bad, but it certainly will be bad if it comes from the east, southeast, or something like that.
Hurricanes typically come from the southeast.
Yes.
So it's too heavy.
Rarely is there any major weather coming out of the northeast. Now, northeastern coastal states like Maine will get storms that will run south on the coast, but those do not affect a major area. It's more coastal on those northeastern coastal states that border the Atlantic. So here was a harbor that would not only provide protection for the ship while they were wintering, but apparently would also fit all the other parameters that would be necessary for them to stay there for the winter time. Lured into a sense of excitement because of a soft south wind, they set sail along the coast of Crete. It was not long, however, until they were caught up by a strong wind. Now, Luke calls it Eurosidon. And this word in the Greek is literally wind and waves. Wind, waves. It's a compound word. Wind, first part, Euro, wind, and slidon or Clydon. I'm not sure the accentuation on that, but that would be waves. It was probably a hurricane. I think it'd be a hurricane in that part of the world. It would be a typhoon. I'm not sure how it's divided. The world
It
is.
depends on if it had a definitive eye. Because what makes a hurricane is the circular movement. And I don't think they would have had hurricanes in the Mediterranean Sea. Because those typically form off the coast of Africa. And even if they do make it up to Europe, they usually go straight up to um, England, the British Isles, or the Scandinavian peninsulas.
Yeah, but there still would be, okay, seem like typhoons
Typhoons or hurricanes, just in a different.
in a different part of the world.
Yeah.
So, but this,
Your
it
flood
would,
could have been a straight line wind.
it's hard to say. It's hard to say because storms in this part of the world are very bad.
Yeah.
Okay? And this certainly had a lot of the aspects of major storms that you see in hurricanes and typhoons and so on. Yes.
It is described as a cyclonic tempestuous northeast wind blows in the Mediterranean mostly in autumn and winter. Cyclonic,
Which means cyclone.
cyclonic,
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
That is U-rock-Lydon.
Ura.
U-Y-O-O, U-rock, R-O-K, L-I-D-O-N.
Euroclydon.
You're rock.
Rock. Okay. All right. Thank you. Regardless, this was God made, not man made.
Yes.
Man didn't have anything to do with it. So they were forced to let the wind drive the ship because they weren't able to control it. When a sail driven ship gets into massive winds like this, they have to take down the sails. Number one, it's going to rip the sails apart. And it will cause the ship to capsize if they're not careful. And as loaded as this ship was, if they kept the sails up, there would have been no chance whatsoever. So dropping the sails, they still were not able to control it. But the ship was actually being driven by the winds and the waves in a direction they really didn't want to go. They were able to get a small reprieve near the island of Clauda, a small island southwest of Crete. Now, it's a tiny thing, not very big at all. There they secured the small boat on board the ship, and they used cables to undergird the ship. Now what's happening here is they're taking, well, in the Northeast they would call it a skiff. It's a small boat that usually is towed behind a larger one. And that is for running between the boat and shore and doing what else needs to be done. So they had to get this boat on shore because they felt like they needed it because it was, number one, a lifeboat. All right. It wasn't big enough to have all 263 people on there, but it was a lifeboat. Yes, 206. How much? How many? 268. Okay. Instead of 263, it's 268. Now, when they got this boat on board and got it secured, then they did something else. Albert Barnes explains this procedure. The ancients were accustomed to pass cables or strong ropes around the vessel to keep the planks from springing or starting by the action of the sea. This is now called frapping a vessel. The operation of frapping a vessel is thus described in Falconer's Marine Dictionary. I have no idea about this publication, okay, but here is quoted. To frap a ship is to pass 4 or 5 turns of a large cable-laid rope around the hull or frame of a ship to support her in a great storm, or otherwise when it is apprehended that she is not strong enough to resist the violent efforts of the sea. Brother Bernie, you were in the Coast Guard for many years.
I've seen it.
You've seen it?
I've seen this type of thing happen too late. Two guys took all their savings, bought a schooner.
Mm-hmm.
One guy's supposed to be staying up, watched the lines, and he didn't. And it went on a sandbar, and they couldn't get it loose. We can recall it took two 44-foot motor lifeboats with twin diesels in there, couldn't get it pulled loose. I had to get out, another guy had to get out to get the line out there. And by the time it's going, the planks on the side of the boat were split apart, so they had to scrap it. So this basically what it does is it keeps those planks from spreading apart.
Right.
That's not used much anymore now, but that's what that is.
Well, most vessels now are not, there's not as many wooden vessels that are,
This was a wooden schooner.
right. Now it's either a composite or metal. But this apparently was not well up into probably the early 1900s. This was a method that was used to try to keep ships together. Yeah, keep from falling apart.
Yeah, the planking on the side went this way, and that it would beat it till pretty soon she would start coming up like this.
Right,
That happened, the water was coming in.
Yeah,
right.
that was the last.
Instead of it being a boat, it's a colander.
Yeah, yeah,
There's not much. I mean, that's their last resort.
right. An instance of this kind is mentioned in Lord Anson's voyage around the world. Now, we're talking about, Dr. Barnes is talking about in the 1800s, okay, which is when he wrote this. And so this information is with the 1800s. Speaking of a Spanish man of war in a storm, he says, and this is this Lord Anson, they were obliged to throw overboard all their upper deck guns. Yeah. And take 6 turns of the cable round the ship to prevent her opening. So this was it was a well-known thing in those days and times. So this is what they did. So after accomplishing this, they once again set sail, but also afraid that they would run aground on the Syrtis sands off the coast of Africa. I'll get into that in just a minute. At one point on this trip, the sailors expressed fear of the Syrtis sands, and that's Acts 27, verse 17. Now you have to wonder why sailors in the ocean will be afraid of sand. Doesn't make sense, does it?
Yes, it does.
but it does. Yes, sir, it does.
If you run aground on the sand, give you a good idea what I'm talking about. When a vessel is run aground, the ocean's going to put sand. It's going to continue to push sand where they can't be pulled off.
Right,
Then the waves are going to come and they're going to meet it.
right,
And that's what happened to that schooner.
yes. Now, here's why. According to ancient historians and geographers such as Dio Chrysostom and Strabo, I'm not familiar with these names, okay? But apparently they were historians who lived at about the same time as Paul and Luke. The sands are shallow gulfs off the coast of Africa. There is a greater and lesser gulf. In other words, there's a big one and then there's a little one, or a smaller one. It may not have been so little, but it was smaller than the other. Excuse me. We know these today as the Gulf of Sirte off the coast of Libya and the Gulf of Gabis off of Tanzania. Tunisia, thank you. Once caught in the Gulf, it's impossible for a large sailing vessel to pull back out or to land safely on the rocky shoals. If they get caught in those, that's it. The Gulf has fearsome cross currents and long sandbars extending miles out to sea. And probably they are just beneath the surface so that they wouldn't be readily seen. Yes. Yes.
If you can see breakers out, because there's a sandbar out there.
Right. Yes.
That would be like the riptides that happen in Florida.
No, riptide is completely different than what we're talking
Yeah, a riptide comes in and then drags back out very forcefully.
And it's usually funnels out.
Right.
If you can stand on the shore and you see breakers 50, 60 feet out there, you know there's a sandbar.
Well, seeing that in this aspect, people that are not aware of these kind of ideas gentlemen's talking about, if they're not aware of them, those things can catch them and they're deadly.
Yes.
Done.
Very deadly.
They will drop a line. People do these now. They will have a depth line that'll have certain marks,
Yes.
and they can tell when the water's getting shallow, whatever.
Yeah, it's called sounding.
Yes.
Sounding, yeah. There's marks. There's little marks on it.
And they did this. All right. Once caught inside, a ship is either destroyed on the rocks or marooned on a sandbar miles from shore. And it's not like you could walk that sandbar to to land.
Because then it's deep.
Yes. So this is a very great concern to these sailors, and rightly so. The ship taking Paul to Rome was one of the largest of its day, as it carried a heavy load of grain. Remember, this was out of Alexandria, Egypt. Egypt was a great grain producing nation at that time. I call your attention to the days of Joseph.
Are they today? Are they still in that state?
Not so much today. One of the reasons why is the Aswan Dam. When they built the dam, that stopped the flooding of Upper Egypt. Because every year, at a certain time of year, in the spring of the year, the Nile River would flood, and it would go out of its banks for miles. Okay? When the water withdrew, that left very fertile soil, so that the Nile River really was the lifeblood of Egypt. But when they built the Aswan Dam, and that was done in the early 20th century, that stopped the flooding. And therefore also stopped the natural ability of the nation to produce as it had. Now they didn't have to use fertilizer or anything like that. Now they do. Now they have to irrigate. Man's ideas are not always the best. So if the ship was caught in the quicksands of Syrtis, death was inevitable. While they are now, they still have a bit of hope. But not if they get caught in those sands. So the sailors had good reason to fear. And there is my source on that. They were now, they were now at the mercy of the winds. They were driven and tossed violently by the tempest. They tried to lighten the load by throwing the ship's tackle overboard. After 3 days of being tossed and turned, they had given up all hope of being rescued or of even getting out of the situation alive. Acts 27 again, beginning with verse 21. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosened from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. He said, yeah, you should have listened to me, but you didn't. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, this is the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded. Now, this is what Brother Bernie was talking about, and Jamie was talking about a while ago, that they would take and do a sounding. That showed a line, a weighted line that was dropped. When it hit bottom, that would show on that line how deep it was. How many fathoms? And sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little farther, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. It's getting shallower. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for day. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea, under color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, this day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. They probably had no time. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. You're going to have to eat. But if you don't eat, you're not going to have the strength to do what's facing you. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. And we were in all the ship 216 souls. When they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, cast out the wheat into the sea. Now that was a major thing. When you throw your cargo overboard, complete loss. And when it was day, they knew not the land. They didn't recognize where the land was. They didn't know, they were not familiar with it. But they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. When they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands. Now, that's not rubber bands, that's rudder bands. In other words, they had the rudders, and apparently there was more than one because it's plural. They had them bound so that they were not going any direction. So they had to loosen them, and they hoisted up the mainsail to the wind and made toward shore. And falling into a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the front part, stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. Now, this is almost like what you were describing a while ago, Brother Bernie.
This was the last resort. They had to do something to keep the ship from running aground.
That was the only thing that they had in order to save their lives.
Exactly.
And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land. And the rest, some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. So we're going to find that they ran aground in Malta. After some time, Paul came with some comforting words. words that were prompted by a visit from an angel. After many days without seeing the sun or the stars, all hope was lost. They navigated by the sun and the stars. That's the way that they knew how to go. Without the sight of either of those, there was no way to determine where they were or any method of determining any direction or heading. They had not eaten in many days when Paul addressed those on the ship. He reminded them they should have listened to him previously, but he encouraged them to take heart, for no lives would be lost, only the ship. He tells them that an angel appeared to him, telling him that there was no need to be afraid, because he, Paul, must appear before Caesar, and that God had granted the lives of all those with him. He encourages them to take heart, although they must run aground on a certain island. After 2 weeks of drifting in the storm on the Adriatic Sea, they ran aground on Malta. Sensing they were nearing ground around midnight, soundings confirmed their fears. The sailors made an attempt to flee the vessel by using the skiff. They were prevented by Paul and the Roman soldiers, allowing the skiff to fall off the ship into the sea. Come dawn, Paul encourages them to eat, and he offers thanks in their midst, in their presence. After eating, they further lightened the ship by throwing the cargo, the wheat, into the sea. During the day, they tried to run the ship into a bay with a beach. The front of the ship ran aground, where two seas met, and the stern, the back of it, began to break up. The Roman soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners, but were ordered not to by the centurion because he wanted to save Paul. He ordered the soldiers to go first so that they would be able to help everyone else. This would also ensure that none of the prisoners would be able to escape. Everyone on the ship made it to land without any loss of life. Some were able to swim, while others were able to make it aboard some broken pieces of the ship. Remember, the back of the ship was beginning to break up. Now, I had extensive background details that I used from A Harmony of the Life of Paul, written by Mark Copeland, copyright 2007. So in conclusion, any questions, comments? Because the conclusion is simply this. In the next part, we'll consider their stay on the island of Malta. Any questions, comments? I don't know where that came from. Yeah, I do. All right. No questions, comments. Brother Jeremy, would you dismiss us, please?
We here at International Missionary Baptist Ministries are so thankful that you chose to watch or listen to this Wednesday evening Bible study. We will be broadcasting again at this same time next week. If you wish to contact us, we can be reached by email at imbr@imbmpodcasts.com. Our mailing address is International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. Again, I repeat, our email address is imbr@imbmpodcasts.com. Podcast is plural there. Our snail mail is International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. We thank you so very much for watching or listening. We hope that this was a blessing to you.